At the altar, she discovers her groom is not what he seems. Naomi Sterling had rehearsed the moment 1,000 ways. The way she would breathe, the way her hand would rest on the velvet of his sleeve, the exact tilt of her chin to catch the light that photographers loved. In the months before the wedding, she had catalogued every small mercy. An extra hour with her dressmaker, a cancelled board meeting, the florist's promise about the orchids, until she had turned possibility into ritual. The wedding was to be a consummation of a life curated down to its finest grain, a final public argument she could not lose. Naomi Sterling, always composed, always chosen. Mourning in her penthouse was a polished thing. Light came like glass across the marble floor, and the chandeliers that usually seemed to scatter themselves into rainbows above the dining table now held a singular, private luminance, as if the room had been reserved for her alone. She moved through it like a woman in an old photograph, measured, deliberate. The champagne stood cool in a silver bucket. Her mother's letters lay atop the vanity, folded with meticulous handwriting instructing her which relatives to greet and what to say about legacy. The world outside was already adjusting itself around the spectacle. She dressed as she had always dressed when a public story was to be written, hands steady, spine practiced. The silk of the gown did not wrinkle beneath the weight of her resolve. Naomi thought of the ways she had learned to be visible without being seen. The perfect laugh, the give of a well-timed admission, the way to let powerful men think they had discovered her when, more often than not, she had given them the shape they wanted. But there had also been an orientation inward, a room she kept carefully sealed, where loneliness was not an absence, but an architecture. Privilege had been a shelter, and a prison both. More than once in the years before Alexander Vale, she had believed her solitude to be an elegant instrument. It allowed her to choose freely among alliances. It kept her private grief from becoming a public narrative. People called it dignity. She called it survival. She could not have known then how easy it would be for a stranger to walk a room and make those walls feel porous. They met in Zurich, under a vaulted ceiling that smelled faintly of wood smoke and citrus. It was the kind of gala that would later populate galleries of glossy images, an exhibition opening, caviar in porcelain spoons, a pianist whose hands made all the right pauses. Naomi noticed him because he moved as though the room were an afterthought. He stood near the back, not at the bar, nor among the sculpted conversations. His jacket was quiet, his hair combed in a way that suggested habit rather than fashion. There was a smallness about his stillness that made him readable to someone who knew the language of reserve. He watched her the way some people study a painting, without the restlessness of wanting to possess. He did not smile at her the way the men at her table smiled. His eyes were steady, not flattering. When their gaze met, she felt a brief, startling flicker of recognition, not for herself but for something in her that rarely had an audience. Her unpresentable fatigue. He did not look scandalized or impressed. He simply returned the weight of her unguardedness with a respect that felt like a mirror. They spoke for 30 minutes on the terrace, where the city was awash of light. He asked questions not out of rote curiosity, but because he wanted the exact shape of her answer. He remembered details, her grandfather's favorite lyric, the color of the scarf she packed on an impulsive trip 2 years before. His voice had a calmness that suggested he carried many years in it, though she knew nothing of his life. When a waiter passed with a tray of oysters, he did not reach. He watched the sea like a man who had not yet decided if appetite was a convenience he would allow himself. There were little things that could have been symptoms of affectation. The slight coolness to his hand, the way he seemed unconcerned by the way time bent for everyone else. But Naomi had lived among careful actors. She was practiced in parsing charm from artifice. What unsettled her was not performance but the quality of his attention. It did not seek to rearrange her, it simply catalogued and held. In a life that demanded spectacle, that in itself was a kind of novelty. After Zurich, he appeared in her periphery with a frequency that felt improbable. Not all of these encounters were planned. In Milan, he was at a small gallery opening she had attended to avoid an awkward investor dinner. He lingered in the doorway as if he had arrived with the building. In Singapore, he appeared at an island bar she often used to be incognito. He ordered nothing, and when she excused herself to take a phone call, he remained, steady as a stone in a river. In Manhattan, he took the night train back to a hotel she would not name. The pattern was not relentless pursuit, it was careful gravity. Their relationship came to be composed of marginally ordinary moments strung into a chain, a quiet cafe where two strangers shared the precise detail of a life. A conversation that veered from art to grief and returned to humor without strain. A walk under an unannounced rain where he held his coat over both their heads as if sheltering them from a weather he did not feel. Never ostentatious, never invasive. In private, he gave her the strangest luxury, the permission to be unadorned. And yet there were anomalies. He rarely spoke of the past in the ways people ordinarily did. When he described a childhood, it felt sketched, like someone tracing the outline of a map without naming the continents. Once, over dinner, he said he had friends scattered across decades, and Naomi had laughed because she had thought him a poet. Another night he left without explanation and returned with the exact tidings of a minor personal crisis she had not yet voiced. Standing beside him on a stone bridge, she learned to notice the whisper in the room when he moved, the hush that seemed to rearrange the air. A waiter touched his shoulder once, an attempt at intimacy, and regret crossed the man's face as if he had broken an unspoken rule. Only later did Naomi give a name to the sensation: impossibility. The proposal came on a cliff in Scotland. It was not a spectacle, no helicopters, no posted photographers. The house that had hosted them for the weekend was a squat thing of stone and peat smoke, its windows casting warm squares against the cold. Two people sat at a small table under a sky that read as a long, low bruise. Alexander spoke of small mortals, of how humans made meaning out of impermanence, and then, without ceremony, told Naomi he wanted to bind his life to hers. He produced a ring that had the odd quality of seeming older than it looked, as if it had been waiting. She remembered the precise way the wind laid itself along the cliff, the gulls' cries threading through the gaps in the stone. She remembered thinking, absurdly, that this choice might be the most honest thing she had ever made. If loneliness had been an architecture she had perfected, he seemed to be asking to dwell in the same rooms. The answer that came from her mouth felt both like an acceptance and a claim. Yes. There were those who said later that the wedding had been inevitable from the moment the ring was slipped. There were others who wrote that Naomi had been seduced by mystery, that she had fallen for an idea. Those narratives would have been comforting to people who needed tidy stories. But the truth slid into a different shape. Naomi married a man who had, in private, listened to the contours of her life and matched them. She married someone who had, in very particular ways, recognized her. The days leading up to the wedding were a choreography of expectation. Invitations had been published in society columns designed to read like delicate threats. Attendance confirmed, seats reserved, cameras positioned. Naomi's mother orchestrated greetings like a conductor, smoothing potential friction before it could show. Security teams had been briefed in a way that felt disproportionate to a ceremony, and there were queries from outlets Naomi barely knew. Still, within the thick glass of the preparations, Naomi maintained a private locus of thought. Sleep had become a commodity she rationed carefully. Mornings were for looking at the faint lines already appearing at the corner of her eyes, and cataloguing them as artifacts of choice rather than decline. She practiced vows in front of a mirror until the words fit the face she would present. But there were things one could not rehearse. The way a confession would sound in a cathedral, the exact weather that would sift through stone, the way a public silence could make private things unbearable. Naomi trusted Alexander in ways she trusted no one, not because he promised safety, but because in the odd quiet of his presence, she had come to believe herself intact. Still, a tension hummed beneath her certainty like a tuning fork left near a speaker. She felt now and then a small disquiet, an awareness that something older than either of them moved at the edges of the arrangement. On the morning of the wedding, the city wore a clear, metallic sky. The cathedral had been selected for its gravity. Gothic arches that caught the breath and stained glass that turned afternoon into a mosaic of light. Guests arrived in a tide of couture and curated grief, the press forming lines that made their own small spectacle of the event. Security moved with discreet confidence, the kind that anticipated storms and flurried them back to the shore. Naomi sat in the car with her mother for a long, exacting hour, looking at the city as if it were a collection of objects she had already appraised. Her mother clasped her hand once, not as a parent, but as an architect of legacies. "Remember," she said, "you have the dignity to choose how you finish this story." Naomi repeated the phrase later, as if testing its weight, the dignity to choose. It did not diminish the gravity of ceremony. It merely put the emphasis where she wanted it. Before the doors opened, she felt a stillness that was not empty. Rather, it was like standing on the lip of a ravine and deciding how to step. A single soft request accompanied the sunlit calm that morning. "If you want to see what she chooses, stay with her until the end." The thought was not an instruction for anyone, but a small, defiant affirmation she made to herself, that the story would be witnessed. The cathedral, when she walked into it, received her with all the solemnity of an age. The aisle was a river of pale carpet between oak pews. The chandeliers hung like condensed constellations. Candles flickered in niches, their flame a soft rebellion against the cool stone. People rose, cameras pivoted with the mechanical hunger of someone waiting to capture a revelation. Naomi moved through the geometry of gazes as if stepping through glass. Her dress caught light in ways that made small constellations travel across her shoulders. Alexander stood at the altar like a perfect, still thing. He had chosen black that morning, an austerity that complemented the cathedral's shadow. His hands were folded, and when their eyes met there was no performative ardor, only that same considered regard that had been the architecture of their entanglement. For a suspended second, Naomi felt entirely unobserved, as if in his presence the room had shrunk to include only what mattered to her. As the priest intoned words that had been practiced and polished to fit the occasion, Naomi's perception shifted in small, precise increments. The temperature in the nave went down. Not a rush of cold, but a slipping of warmth the cathedral had held, as if someone had opened a window into a deeper weather. She felt it first along her fingertips, a slight numbness that ran like something foreign. The candles nearest the altar dimmed, as if inhaling a long, indifferent sigh. Somewhere in the back a glass shivered faintly, enough for the clergy's voice to lose its seam. Alexander began to speak of promises and the future in a voice as even as carved stone. There was an oldness to his cadence, a metronome that suggested rehearsal, but contained none. He looked at her with a clarity that felt almost clinical, and then, within the hushed wings of the cathedral, he said something that was not ceremony. "I am not as you are," he said. The voice was steady. "I do not age the way you do. I am not kept by the nights. If you join me, you will join a balance that is not ordinary." The words landed like a bell struck in a long, empty hall. For a moment the sound stretched and held the world inside it, and Naomi's heart, trained to its biographies of featureless control, found a new rhythm. The congregation pressed toward her with the force of expectation. Mothers, sisters, Colleagues leaned forward with the hunger to witness a narrative resolve. She felt the cameras lurch like beasts. Behind Alexander, stained glass caught the light and threw it into ribs of color across his shoulder. The candle's flame, which had been steady a moment before, collapsed into a fragile sputter. At the touching of his hand to the altar, a line of cold uncoiled. Her skin met his sleeve and found the fabric eerily chilly. It was a physical fact that did not require interpretation. Coolness, where there should have been warmth. Naomi's mind performed its usual work in an extraordinary landscape. Catalogue, weigh, decide. Fear licked along the edges of her composure, not as a scream but as a small, inexorable calculation. There were questions, immediate and unanswerable. How did this work? What did he mean by balance? Was it rhetorical flourish, or a literal geometry of consequence? Her training told her to call off the event, to demand a private explanation, to stage an escape. The cameras would have had their images. The press might have fed on scandal. Her mother would have had scripts prepared, damage control at morning's first light. But intimacy had braided itself into her judgment. In the years of his presence, Alexander had given her a kind of reflective space where she could be diminished and still be held. He had not demanded spectacle, only presence. Naomi felt the old architecture of her loneliness tilt at the edges. There was a draw toward the man she had promised to ourselves, a lover and an enigma both. Someone could describe that motion as foolishness. Naomi, in the cathedral, named it differently. It was the strange gravity between promise and person. He met her eyes and continued in a voice without drama. If you bind yourself to me, your life will account differently for mine. The world, time adjusts. I do not slip toward age. There is a balancing cost. It will be paid in a way that touches you. There was no pleading in him. If anything, his admission was a restraint. It was the kind of honesty one would expect from a person who had learned to live in long shadows. There was guilt, too, not the theatrical guilt of a repentant lover, but the small, plain regret of a being who understood the arithmetic of consequence. Naomi felt the word tether form in her mind like an instrument, a bond that was not merely legal but kinetic, pulling at the axis of what she was. The cathedral seemed to lean toward them. A murmur fluttered, like wind through dead leaves. Guests shifted, their faces a gallery of waiting. Her mother, seated in the front pew, showed a flash of consternation and then composure. An expression women in her class had perfected the way soldiers learned to conceal pain. Security straightened, their posture a web of readiness and denial. Naomi, in the center of this pressure, felt both small and enormous. Alexander's confession continued, not with diagrams or metaphors, but with the plainness that made it more monstrous. I do not sleep as you do. I do not hunger as you do. I endure in ways you cannot imagine. When I am near, the world finds equilibrium by compensating. For you, this might mean years condensed, or the quickness of lines gathering where they will. I cannot tell you the measure. I can only tell you that there is a cost. If you consent, it will bind you. It was not the sort of sentence built for a public forum. It was the kind of necessary truth exchanged between people who had counted the ledger of each other's lives together. Naomi's throat worked. The vows, the rehearsed syllables, seemed suddenly ridiculous, an artful script around a calculus she had not agreed to in so many words. She could feel the place where the choice would fracture, the private weight of wanting him, the public weight of everything she was. She had agency, she told herself. She had always had agency. The word was a balm and a blade. The dignity to choose remained in her bones. She could, in that instant, step back and demand clarity, demand that he explain the exact terms. She could walk away, or she could accept knowingly the bargain. The decision had the shape of a sacrament and a surrender. Alexander's hands were now before him, not folded but open, as if to show there was nothing to hide. He spoke with clarity and an absence of rhetorical flourish. You should know who stands before you. You should know what you carry if you join me. Naomi's body, trained to the smallest cues of power, took census of sensations. The wedding band that had been placed under the pillow in the hours before seemed suddenly a small, decisive artifact. The coolness of his sleeve on her fingers was not metaphor. It was proof. She felt improbably a flash of anger at the suddenness, at what was being asked of her without the slow, soft argument of time. She felt also, perversely, the old ache that had made her answer his first questions in Zurich. He had seen her. That had been in its own way nothing less than intimacy. Guests watched as if at a play. Some faces folded in horror, some in fascination. The cameras tilted, hungry for the angle. Still between him and her the cathedral held a small private air, as if she and he had moved a foot to the left, and the whole world had not noticed. Naomi measured. She remembered nights when she had plotted exit strategies and letters of withdrawal, the legal drafts that sat in her safe. She remembered the philanthropy that felt like repair, the projects where her money had been a bridge rather than a barrier. She thought of her mother's instructions and the ledger of social good she had been taught to manage. She also thought of the man who had watched her not to possess, but to keep along with him. It was not a neat arithmetic. Words tried to form in her mouth, the rehearsed vows, or perhaps a demand for lawyers. She imagined the headlines. Socialite discovers Groom's secret at altar. She imagined 1,000 small analyses. But the thought that blocked all papery things was elemental and immediate. She had to answer in a way that would not be undone by regret. Agency was not simply the right to act. It was the right to inflict dignity upon the action chosen. Her pulse beat in time, once, twice, and then she noticed a peculiar detail. Sound felt slightly off, not absent but distant, like music heard through a thick door. That, too, she catalogued. Her body, always an honest instrument when she listened, registered an onset of something. A tiny aberration at the corner of sight, a sharpening of the lines at the edge of the stained glass that made them look almost like hairlines in the world. Alexander had not asked for secrecy. He had not demanded silence. His confession was not designed to manipulate. It was a conceding of fact. "I will not make you vanish," he said, the journalist's truthfulness of the statement making it harsher. "I will not promise eternity. You will remain yourself and yet nearer to the kind of thing that needs balancing. The choice must be yours because the consequence rests with you." Naomi felt the congregation like weather. She reached for the smallest of agencies, to speak, to ask for a moment, to call for an adjournment. But she also felt the old, quieter desire to be known without having to perform bravery. She thought of being able to sleep in a way that did not require subterfuge, of waking without the reflex to measure. She considered the ledger of time, years folded into months, months into breaths, and felt, with an odd clarity, the singular beauty of her mortal measurement. Between the candled pews and the stone, with faces sharp as coins, and the press leaning forward as if about to take a bite, Naomi made a choice, in the way someone facing a storm might decide whether to step forward or remain under a ledge. The choice at that second was not yet a commitment verbs could hold. It was the narrowing of attention, the insistence that she would answer in her terms. She did not speak then. Her silence was active, intentional. It was a pause that contained the weight of possible worlds. The balance he had spoken of seemed to tilt, not toward love nor away from it, but toward the very essence of what would follow. Consequence measured in living tissue and the arc of days. A hush descended, the kind that feels like the first fold in a long garment. Naomi felt fingers loosen around the bouquet she had held for a minute too long. The world seemed to bend its edges toward that possible word. Cameras clicked like insects. Her mother's face was unreadable. In the periphery, security leaned marginally to one side, signaling readiness. The priest's voice scrambled for ritual, for the buoy of liturgy to reclaim them. Alexander's confession hung, luminous and terrible. It made the cathedral small, brought the crowd into a single, breathing organism. Naomi's hand brushed his sleeve again, this time with intention, not ceremony, and found the same coolness, a chill that did not equal the weather. It was a sensation like an animal's warning, outwardly innocuous, internally loud. She tasted in her mouth the metallic tang of calculus. She thought of the dignity to choose, the echo of her mother's instruction. She thought of the many small compromises that had stitched her life, the speeches that sounded like virtue but were ledgered as strategy, the marriages of convenience between patron and art she had quietly encouraged so that institutions would thrive. She understood then that this was not merely a private choice, but a ledger that would touch her flesh. Around them, life continued in editorial rhythm. Cameras, notes, the propriety of a congregation logging a scandal. Inside Naomi, the voice of calculation sat with the voice of desire and the voice of fear, each weighing the other. Her agency was not a sudden lightning bolt that chose without labor. It was the slow consummation of a person living within her means. She lifted her head. The cathedral light found the thin new lines at the corner of her eye and made them look like small fault lines on a map. She breathed. There was a small, steadying word in her mind that had nothing to do with public story. Choose. Her hand tightened on the bouquet. The cameras leaned forward as if they could accelerate the event with attention alone. Alexander looked at her with a patience that felt like the sympathy of someone giving someone else the final page of an unread book. The choice waited, not like a trap, but like a hinge. In that fragile, magnificent instant, every part of Naomi that had learned to command a room and every part that had learned to endure darkness began to conspire toward a single point of will. She let the word settle in the cathedral like a stone dropped into deep water. Choose. The syllable was a hinge. It did not solve anything. It simply marked the shape of an intention. When she finally spoke, her voice surprised her by how small it sounded and how absolute. "I will," she said, and the two words took the space between them like a lock. No dramatic flourish, no pleading. The cameras stuttered. The priest cleared his throat as if ritual might salvage the scene. Around them, faces blurred into color and sound. Alexander closed his eyes for the length of a breath, and when he opened them, they were both an apology and a benediction. The moment their hands met, palms pressed as one, something older than the chandeliers answered. Naomi felt a pull that began at the place where their flesh touched and extended inward along the ribs, a tug like a string pulled taut inside her sternum. It was not violent, but it was immediate, an intimate recalibration. Air tightened. The candles nearest the altar, already fighting the chill that had threaded through the nave, guttered and steadied as if their wax had learned something new. A hum, like the aftertaste of a bell, floated under the priest's words and hovered at the edges of hearing. Guests inhaled as though the room had been made smaller. Some hands went to mouths. Security shifted the angle of their bodies. Naomi felt the coolness of Alexander's sleeve at the line where his wrist met her fingers, cool like a window pane in winter. And the sensation registered wholly beyond metaphor. He was a thing that did not warm the world. "I bind myself to you," she said, and the words were both grant and claim. In that breath, the cathedral bore witness to a consent that was not merely legal. It was kinetic, immediate, an exchange, a balance tipping. The ledger had been opened. Outside, men with press passes and lenses had already prepared lines and teases. Inside, something happened to the cathedral's clockwork. Time did not stop, but its texture changed for her in a way she would later try and fail to explain. Minutes sharpened into the cut of an hourglass, narrowing at the neck. It was not always a theft, so much as a folding. Days gathering at the corners, inches of life pressed into denser slices. The ceremony stumbled to its end under a sheen of public confusion and private gravity. Photographers forced respectful smiles. A handful of guests left, needing air as if the cathedral had made them suddenly unwell. Naomi's mother maintained a practiced face. There was consternation threaded through her jaw, and yet she sat with the same composure that had raised Naomi into public life. She said nothing then. She would later file statements with the efficiency of someone reweaving a cloak. After the vows, the reception was a blink of ritual choreography at the edges of a disaster. Cameramen took brief, hungry shots while staff whispered about cancellations and damage control. Naomi moved through it like someone in a borrowed self, smiling where needed, making small talk that had been practiced for less complicated things. Alexander was near as always, his stillness now threaded with something like shame. He answered questions as he had always answered, simply, without savoring applause. The world outside reconstructed the story into neat parts for readers hungry for spectacle, romance, mystery, scandal, because that is what public life does. But Naomi felt the ledger thrum. They retreated in time to the privacy she had built into the map of her life. A small house on the edge of the city, modern glass caught against the river, where light always seemed to arrive in clinical panels. Inside, once the guests had been shepherded from the property and the security teams had posted their discreet sentries, Naomi and Alexander sat across from one another with the sort of honesty that confesses more than intention, the realism of consequence. He bowed his head in a way that could be read as grief. "I told you," he said, but it was not a defense. It was the admission of someone who had, across his own long corridors of experience, learned to speak plain truths because he could not live with themselves if he hid them. "And I heard," Naomi answered. Her throat felt raw as if she had spoken too often in wind, and yet... She looked at him, really looked. Not the public Alexander, but the man who, in quiet places, had listened. "I wanted you in my rooms, more than I wanted another story." He flinched, as if from a small pain, then smiled with a humility that belonged better to a man than a ghost. "You wanted a witness," he offered. He did not claim to be the only witness possible, nor did he pose as the only remedy to her loneliness. That, as much as anything, softened the shape of their mistake. The first weeks that followed the binding were an education in fine, cruel things. At first, the signs were small enough to be deniable. Naomi would wake and see a new shadow at the corner of her eye. A hair that had been dark the night before showed a thread of silver in the morning mirror. She blamed lighting, exhaustion, the work of an intense week. Then nights shortened without explanation. She would go to bed and find sleep unnatural, an unnecessary instrument that both cheated and compressed her time. Dreams came thick and brief, as if memory were a book whose pages were glued together. She would wake with the sense she had traveled a day's worth of experiences in a single condensed sweep. Physical changes arrived as whispers that became facts. A faint line deepened at the corner of her mouth until it showed up in photographs like the crease of a map. Colleagues noticed a new wear in her smile. Friends commented politely about the stress she had endured. She laughed off questions about anything unusual. People always felt relief when a woman in her position could dismiss a hint of weakness. But what grew impossible to ignore was not the way she looked, but the way time itself behaved around her. There were small thefts. An hour she had planned to spend with a friend would be folded into bills of hours elsewhere. An afternoon that should have been a long, languid half-day to inspect a philanthropic grant passed like a wink. She arrived late. The meeting had concluded. The minutes with a summary of decisions left on a table as if they had been waiting. Naomi began to find days consumed by the space of what felt like a single conversation. A week, which had once been a careful set of parcels, became an accordion that could be pulled through only so many times. Alexander watched her with an expression that alternated between the terror of love and the embarrassment of responsibility. He was careful in small, human ways. He insisted she eat. He closed doors at night. He read aloud sometimes just to make sure sound filled the rooms they had hired for themselves. He tried to measure what the tether took and what the world returned. But there were no ledgers to bear that weight. "It is not greedy," he said once, at a table set for two where the sunlight made a precise rectangle across Naomi's paperwork. "It is indifferent. It corrects." "Corrects what?" she asked, because the word sat like a shard. "Imbalance," he said. The answer was both precise and infuriatingly vague. He described the phenomenon in metaphors, a scale adjusting its weights, a tide finding its level. He refused to couch it in arrogant absolutes. He refused also to be a deity who could not claim responsibility for the consequences. He told Naomi that his equilibrium needed a counterweight, and she had given it. This was not an argument for blame. Naomi, who had always been practiced at passing influence from intention, recognized in his admission a kind of sorrow that did not seek absolution. He did not ask forgiveness in a way that would later allow him to be forgiven in public. He asked for understanding, and in the privacy of dusk, he would sometimes press his forehead against hers and murmur apologies that felt like benedictions. But apologies did not stop small hours from collapsing into less than she expected. She missed the slow accumulation of domestic rhythms, afternoons spent with books, the unforced forgiveness of sleep, the weightless accrual of years. Instead, she was given moments densely packed, intense as jewels but short and costly. She felt her vitality drawn in a way that felt like ledger entries, a donation, a price, an exchange. The irony of her life, the one who had always curated her days, was that she could no longer allocate them with the same ease. Outside, the world supplied its own pressure. Rumors morphed into stories. Photographers made icons out of the oddness of her face caught in the light. Late-night hosts spun the moment into caricature. Her camp issued statements that were watched and then dissected. Naomi felt the glare more as inertia than as attack. People had been offered a shape, and they wanted to file it into categories they could sell. She found this maddening in the way one finds bureaucracy maddening, stale and uninventive. Her mother called often, less a voice than a program, asking for assurances and strategic angles. Naomi's replies were careful. She would not allow pity nor opportunism to be the reason for her shame. In private, the questions turned inward. What had she sacrificed to be seen by the man she loved? She could recite the ledger of it, the currency of nights, the small excisions of time, the way her doctor had frowned just once, then reassured her that stress had many faces. She took pills at times to help her sleep, then swore them off because they dulled something she still wanted, clarity. She refused, stubbornly, to let the tether become an excuse to retreat. If anything, the knowledge of diminished time made her more deliberate. She packed into days what she had once let diffuse. There were tender moments, too. For every calculus of loss, there were instances where the tether made room for truth. Alexander could stand with her in the cold and understand that her small jokes were shields, that her lover's language was often a currency. He sometimes produced small personal clarities. The exact lyric from a childhood song she had forgotten, the name of an artist she had loved, a memory she had not told him. Those things were not transactional. They were intimate gifts that did not cost him anything visible. In those hours, she felt seen in a way the public had never managed. She had not given up the right to be larger than a packet of time. She had given a part of it to a being whose company she found irreplaceable. But patient love does not erase a ledger's arithmetic. Where she had thought the cost manageable, An afternoon here, a thread of hair there. Time instead accumulated into a pattern. Years, measured in the private eye, began to gather in denser clusters than Naomi had expected. She watched friends age in ways formed by ordinary clocks, while segments of her life removed themselves into memories that felt both thick and incomplete, like chapters torn out of a book. The first time she decided to reclaim the ledger, it was small and deliberate. She had been evaluating a grant at her kitchen table when she noticed a photograph on the mantel. An image of her father at a charity inauguration, his hair still dark. A clean line of regret passed through her. She thought of the life her father had wanted for her, one of influence used as architecture for others, and she understood in a fresh way that being a presence was not the same as being possession. She watched the way the light crossed the sill and, for the first time since the cathedral, held a decision like a knife. She made plans not out of a sudden panic, but as someone making the precise arrangements for a voyage. There would be a conversation with Alexander. She did not imagine tricking him. Her agency was not a cloak to be worn in secrecy. She intended to withdraw consent honestly, knowing exactly what it might cost both of them. The morning she told him, the sky was low and blue as sheet music. They walked in the small garden at the back of her house, where winter had not yet forgotten its shape. Frost, when Naomi breathed on it, left faint designs on the leaves. The grass crouched under a thin ice. The air pressed like a thoughtful hand against their faces. "I cannot keep giving you my time," Naomi said, and even her own voice sounded new to her, less a negotiation than an assertion. "I will not be the cost of your endurance." Alexander listened without interruption. There was pain in the realness of his face that had nothing to do with theatrics. "I never wanted that for you," he said. He had the humility of someone accustomed to long loneliness. It gave him an oldness that was not purely physical. "You must understand. I never asked you to pay in ways you did not choose. You did not ask," Naomi conceded, "but your existence demands balancing. I did not know the measure. I thought I could share, be generous. But generosity does not mean becoming the ledger." He reached for her hand. His fingers closed around hers with a warmth that surprised her. "If you choose to release me," his voice broke on the last word like glass, "I will not ask you to return." That was the language she needed. No bargaining for more life, no quiet pleas for another sacrifice. He was not trying to persuade with false promises. He offered himself to the shape of her decision. The release was not a dramatic incantation. There were no scripts, no words of power standard in mythic stories. Instead, Naomi approached it as she approached all things, with clarity and a sense for the exactness of grief. "Then let us do it honestly," she said. "Here." They returned to the house. Naomi prepared a small room. No witnesses, not because secrecy was essential, but because she wanted the gesture to be between two people and not a public consumption. She dressed simply, avoiding the trappings of ceremony. The ring Alexander had given her glinted like a small coin on the dressing table. She held it for a while and noticed how the metal warmed coldly in her palm. It had been a promise, and promises can be unmade. She had considered many possible methods: legal severance, a public statement retracting consent, exile. None of these would address the metaphysical architecture between them. The tether, if it took the shape the world had claimed it did, required an act of the will, a revocation that could not be buried in paperwork. Naomi understood now that consent, once given in such a way, could also be withdrawn in a fashion that was not merely symbolic, but affective. She would be the instrument of the release. Alexander knelt before her like a supplicant of a different sort. He had tried before to articulate the mechanics of what tether meant in metaphors she could hold without being frightened. He spoke little now. Instead, he watched her face as if memorizing it, afraid of losing what love had taught him to preserve. "If you withdraw," he said softly, "I will go between." She understood the word as he used it, A place not quite life and not quite absence. A liminal space that allowed for nothing of the full, bright friction of living. There would be no annihilation, perhaps. Instead, a wandering in margins, a solitude transformed into a silence beyond human comprehension. The notion horrified and devastated her equally. She had loved him, and the thought of consigning him to a less-than-living existence stung the way a cold wind can sting the eyes. "This is not punishment," she told him. "This is not vengeance. This is a return to the world where beings have the dignity of a clock that winds by itself. I will not be the reason your existence is prolonged at my expense." He reached for her, and she took his hands in both of hers, an adult, an equal. They stood in that exchange, two lovers who had made a bargain and now would unmake it because love had taught them to prefer freedom over a life borrowed. The release unfolded with a violence that was quiet, the sort of violence that takes a thing apart, cleanly. Naomi did not say arcane phrases. She simply spoke her decision aloud in the room, steadiness in each syllable as if she were signing a document in the presence of witnesses made of air. "I withdraw my consent," she said. "I cannot be your balance. I do not consent to this tether any longer." It was a small sentence, frugal and absolute. Alexander let out a sound, half prayer, half surrender. The air around them responded, the hum they had both felt since the cathedral rose up in a tone that vibrated in the bones. For Naomi, it was like having an inner seam drawn out. A sweetness of pain that she had never known washed through her. The world narrowed with a ringing that focused all sensation into a bright, concentrated point. She felt something peel away from the center of her sternum. It was not the pulling of life so much as the unthreading of a woven thing. Warmth fled in a sheet. A cold sensation like glass being drawn from hot water slid across her skin. Her vision thinned at the edges. Colors became more precise before they leached. There was a pressure in her ears, then an emptiness like a room left with a single light still on. Alexander's form responded as if touched by an invisible hand. The outline of him shimmered, not unlike heat above asphalt, but pregnant with an otherness that made Naomi's bones ache. He reached for her hard, fingers clawing at a presence that was slowing. "Naomi," he said, and his voice was a thing she wanted to catch and keep. "Naomi." She let go. Her hand opened and fell away from his. It felt like the most sacramental act she had ever performed, to release not out of force but out of love. The world folded into a thinness and then a space. Alexander's edges frayed like a picture left too long in sun. He did not scream. He did not collapse into grotesque ruin. Instead, his figure became less present, like someone stepping through a curtain. In the place he had been, there remained an impression, an echo of him that tasted like metal and sea. For a long and almost never-ending 2 or 3 seconds, Naomi thought she might be able to call him back with a single word and undo everything with the power of a plea. She resisted that artifice. She held to the fact that agency had a form, and that love without possession had a dignity. Then he was between. The space where he had been shimmered and then steadied into normal air. For a moment the hum persisted, then it dissipated like breath. The room felt colder, as if the human volume of a life had been removed and left an afterchill. Naomi sank to a chair and pressed her fingers to her chest. There was a taste of metal and of rain on her tongue. Her chest moved in a way that was difficult at first, the lungs working after being asked to do more than they expected. She expected to be undone. She expected physical collapse or the kind of immediate violent restitution that would mimic the harm the tether had done. Instead, there was an odd, slow steadiness as the hours realigned. She slept for a long stretch and woke with her cheek pressed to the pillow, the light through the window making a new pattern of lines across her face. Her skin felt raw but not ruined. There were lines, Yes, tokens of cost, but there was also a peacefulness that held like a net. Alexander did not disappear into oblivion. That, at least, was a difference between myth and the law she had made with him. He went to the spaces between, moments that felt like a nowhere that was not absence. At times, Naomi thought she felt the residue of him like the aftertaste of perfume. At other times, there seemed to be nothing but a silence that carried his name. The world adjusted. The hum that had threaded through their lives quieted. The press lost interest in the rumor of him in a way that had nothing to do with fairness. In the months that followed, Naomi reclaimed an ordinary metric of time. Sleep returned more honestly. Days again had the slow architecture of an uncompressed life. The thinning she had felt resolved into a series of new lines and a few silver threads she learned to weather with a kind of pride. She did not pretend she had not paid a price. In small, private ways, some things had been taken that could never be purchased back. Friends called with voices that had seen hair silver differently. Some stayed close, some drifted away. But in the quiet she felt an access to herself that had not been there before. A recovery of agency that resembled a moral muscle regained through exercise. She turned much of her attention outward in a way that felt like both repair and tribute. Her philanthropic work changed shape. Instead of funding grand projects that traced her name brightly across buildings, she visited small institutions, libraries, community arts programs, palliative care units. She used her influence to seed projects that did not require her constant oversight. The way a gardener might plant resilient seeds and then step back to see them thrive. She gave in ways that sought to restore time and dignity to others. Grants for caregivers, programs for the elderly who wished to age with grace, scholarships for those whose lives had been rendered precarious by forces beyond their control. There were nights she would sit in front of the window and watch traffic move like an agitated river. The city looked different to her as she aged. Where she had once seen a map of potential, she now read a city of lives with time enough to matter. She learned to tell stories that did not seek to possess her listeners, but to make room for them. The architecture of relationships changed as well. She forged bonds with people who aged with her, friends whose hair silvered in company, and who showed up with casseroles and fierce tenderness. She did not chase immortality. She learned to attend to the small rituals of human life, the making of tea, the slow reading of a letter, the long phone calls that were not about transactions but about staying. Years stacked themselves in quiet, honest ways. Naomi's hair went from dark to a silver that caught light like the skin of a river. Her face carried lines deepened by laughter and the occasional frown, but there was a difference between a mark made by pain and one made by living fully. She moved through boardrooms and community centers with a low, renewed authority that had nothing to do with the sheen of headlines. Her name, formerly tabloid bait, became associated with a foundation that bore her father's name but had become something more human under her stewardship. She sought out projects that honored the dignity of end-of-life care, the sanctity of childhood unscarred by neglect, the importance of giving unspectacular time to those who had none. Once, more than a decade after the cathedral, Naomi found herself in a gallery opening where an installation of glass sculptures caught the light like a congregation of transparent people. She stood in front of a piece that refracted her silhouette and saw the map of her life reflected back. Lines, shards, repaired edges. A woman beside her, perhaps in her 50s, reached for Naomi's sleeve and said simply, "You look well." Naomi smiled, not with the practiced smile of her youth, but with something that felt like acceptance. "Thank you," she said. "I am learning to." The years had given her friends, projects, and the slow accumulation of ordinary joys. A niece who loved to climb into her lap, an old friend whose laugh carried a particular lilt, a quiet Sunday when the light in her kitchen was absolutely right. She was not unmarked by the tether's cost. She carried an ache like a wart that could not be removed, a knowledge of days shortened and compressed. But when she looked back, she understood that choosing to let go had been the bravest thing she had ever done. She had not been diminished, she had been given back to herself. Time, which had once been a commodity she bid for and managed, became a quiet teacher. She relearned patience and, along the way, the peculiar contentment of endings that are not swallowed by performance. She listened more. She held hands more. She did the small things people forget matter, sending a card, staying for an extra hour with an ill friend, learning the names of neighbors. Decades later, when age had given her the kind of hands that carried both tremor and memory, Alexander returned. It began with a knock at a door in the middle of a rain, where the city had the weather's melancholy. Naomi, now older and slower, opened to a man she would have known in any room. He had changed in the way that human beings change, not by the absence of edges, but by the settling of them. His hair was not the shadow it had been. It had grown thin with a silver that belonged to a man who had walked along the ordinary current of time. He held himself as someone who had learned to care for a finite thing, breath. She stared at him for a long moment. There was recognition and an odd, childlike shock at seeing a thing return transposed. He bore none of the iridescent strangeness he once had. There was no remnant hum, no coldness around his wrists. He seemed human, tenderly so. His eyes were familiar, uncannily so, but with a new softness, as if he had learned what it felt like to wear age as a garment. Her first thought, sudden, simple, was that he had become what she had always wanted him to be, someone who understood the measure of a day. "Naomi," he said, and the name he chose to use was the same name that had once divided the world. There was gratitude braided through the way he spoke. He did not grovel, he did not demand. He came bearing the heavy humility of someone who had been given a second ordinance of life to learn. "Alexander," she answered, aware as always of the way the name wrapped around her like a memory. He was not precisely the man she had loved. He was not a creature of some fracture in time so much as a man who had somehow found himself unframed and placed within the ordinary world. They sat in chairs grown soft with years. He told her in pieces the story of what being between had been. He spoke with the sort of dispassionate tenderness that had always made Naomi's heart ache. There had been long corridors of sameness, where time did not move toward the small victories of day, but rather hung like a portrait. He had been lonely in a way only the unmoored understand, a long, patient absence that was not annihilation, but an erosion of possibility. He had learned a language of edges and silence. Then he spoke of something else, the fact that he had found a path out, not by claim of power, nor by purchase, but by a slow unraveling of the metaphysical architecture that had kept him from counting days like other men. Perhaps it was because Naomi had released him with humanity rather than vengeance. Perhaps it was because the balance had shifted in ways none of them could fully read. He said he had walked, slowly and painfully, into a life where hunger and sleep and the small aches of living had reacquainted him with being human. He had felt his first true hunger as a small, triumphant pain. He had slept until the dream came like a visitor and not a deception. Those ordinary phenomena had been revelations. "I do not know why I am returned thus," he said. "Perhaps balance has its own mercy. Perhaps the cost had to be paid. I cannot explain it in ways that will satisfy science or scripture. I can only tell you that I am different. I have learned to carry time." Naomi listened. She was not naive. She had known that freedom has consequences, some of which could not be foreseen. The man before her had returned without the arrogance of a myth reclaimed. He came as someone who had been taught humility by the very thing that had once made him inhuman. There was a long silence then, threaded with the ordinary sounds of a city on a rainy evening. Between them sat a small teacup, the steam curling like a promise. Naomi thought of all she had given up and all she had received. The ledger, as always, remained both precise and morally textured. "You came back," she said, and there was a softness to her voice. "You did not ask for me to hold you. You came as a man." He reached for her hand. The touch was warm and fully human, the kind that registered as both comfort and the careful pressure of another life. His fingers were not the glass cold of the cathedral. They fit her hand with the small, ordinary certainty of someone who knew how to give and receive in the same breath. "I came back for reasons I cannot fathom," he said. "But mostly, I came back because you asked for a thing I had not understood. You asked for dignity, and you did not demand my annihilation. You asked for truth." Naomi smiled, a slow, honest curl of mouth that had cost her decades to learn. "We both asked for too much once," she said. "You asked to be seen, and I asked for a kind of rescue that was not mine to give." They spoke about less important things then. The city, mutual acquaintances, the small arts of living. He told her how he had learned to cook eggs, and how terrifying that small task had been, because for the first time he worried about being clumsy in a kitchen where mistakes meant spoiling food rather than altering the texture of an eternity. She told him of the Foundation's latest projects, and the way children had come to the library and sat cross-legged on the floor listening to stories. They exchanged memories without the bareness of accusation or the need to archive pain. Near the end of the conversation, as the room softened into the dim blue of evening, Alexander reached for something in his pocket. He produced an object that had the tempered shine of the ring she had once held. He did not offer it as a claim. He held it like a relic, and with a small human laugh said, "For what it's worth, I never thought a ring would bind me to anything. It always felt like a question." Naomi took it and turned it over in her fingers, the way someone might look at an old coin. She did not return it to him, nor did she keep it as treasure. Instead, she slid it into her palm and then tucked it into the drawer where she kept small things. Photographs, notes, a fountain pen. It felt like putting away a tool that had once been necessary. The night stretched into morning with the soft, dull tenor of ordinary sleep. Naomi died years later in a room full of sun. It was not a violent passing, but a quiet diminution that everyone who had loved her recognized as a conclusion rendered with dignity. Her breaths grew shallow and then stilled, her hand warm in the grip of a niece who had learned to love her in the small, unheralded ways the world grants when people show up for one another. Alexander stood at the foot of the bed, not as a myth returned to claim a story, but as a man who had learned what mortality required. There were tears in his eyes, not dramatic nor staged, but the kind that scraped the throat and made the body remember the possibility of grief. He bent and kissed her forehead, an act of intimacy that cost him as much as any sacrament. "You chose," he said, and it was simple. "I lived," she answered with a quiet pride. That was the point. The final moments were small. The smell of lavender, the light across the wooden floor, the quiet oddness of street noise through thin glass. Naomi's last sense was the feeling of her life closing not with a scream, but with the quiet slam of a book lain upon a table. Her eyes opened for a second as if to confirm the presence of life, and then they closed. After she died, Alexander did not collapse into mystical longing. He walked forward through his days like a man learning to be measured. There were sorrowful nights. There were also mornings when he made tea and hummed a song Naomi had loved. He found a workaday bravery in learning what it meant to live without the distance of otherness. He kept a small parcel of things that had once belonged to Naomi, and from time to time set fresh flowers where she had kept the photograph of her father. He learned to carry memory without turning it into possession. Naomi's foundation continued, run by people she had trained and those who had loved her for reasons more than fame. The library she had supported grew new programs, A bench in a small park bore a plaque with her name. People cited her name sometimes in profiles about courageous generosity. But among those who had loved her, she was remembered less as an icon than as someone who had taught by example that choosing to release love can be an act of the highest fidelity. The city moved on in its indifferent ways, but the small architecture of lives had shifted under the careful pressure of her decisions. People who had once watched her as spectacle now told stories about a woman who had, in the quiet, chosen freedom for both herself and the man she had loved. Alexander, who had once been a fracture in time, became one of many faces walking the city streets, someone who paid attention to the small courtesies of being human. In the end, the point of Naomi's story was not the sensational moment under the cathedral's arches, but the way she lived after it. The choices she kept making when spectacle had left, when the cameras were not inclined to cover the slow acts of care that constitute a life. She taught by example that dignity demands the courage to choose one's own measure of days, and that love, to be true, must never be an instrument of possession. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more long-form tales of love, choice, and the quiet ways people reclaim their lives.